Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you could all join us. Just letting you know that tonight's presentation is sponsored by Barley Snyder, Attorneys at Law. During the presentation, if you have any questions, you can place them in the Q&A section or the chat, and at the end of the presentation, I will go through them and we will ask Anika. The presenter, Anika Orrock, is an award-winning illustrator, writer, comic artist, designer, storyteller, and author of The Incredible Women of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. Anika's work is included in the Society of Illustrators' 62nd Annual Exhibition and Book and has been featured in national publications including The Washington Post, The New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, and on NPR. In 2018, she created the illustrations for Socks, the modern classic Christmas album by the J.D. McPherson Band. And I'll turn this over to Anika.
It would be great if Anika unmuted herself. Hello, and thank you so much for having me. This is really, really cool. And I, after exploring a few photos of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, I wish I were actually with you there in person. But this is the next best thing. Thank you. Hello, yes, my name is Anika, and that was a nicer introduction than I could give to myself. But I will just introduce myself a little bit further by telling you who I am and why I'm here, and why this experience is something that I'm excited to share with you. I'm actually going to share my screen because I have some visuals included in this presentation. So let's see. Hello. Okay, well, while this is loading, okay, so I guess this is the official title of what I'm sharing with you, but it's really so much more. And the thing that I love most about this and about my experience and sharing these stories is story itself. These are just some incredible stories, and really, when it took me several years to research and create this book, which this is the book. And there was a lot that went into researching it, which I will tell you about, and writing it. But what I hadn't expected was what would happen when it was published, which was very unique in that this book was published 3 days before pandemic lockdown. So I had to change gears very quickly, recalibrate and navigate releasing my first published work when there was no baseball, when there was no anyone doing anything. And it was challenging. We all had our challenges. I was still very lucky, all things considered, of course. But it took a moment like that to sort of understand what had just happened. I was so focused on creating the book that, I was on the phone with a friend right after we all kind of had to shelter in place. And they mentioned that, this was kind of our World War II moment, so to speak, where it was something that was going to change everything, and that it was defining, and our character and what we did with it was going to matter. And it just sort of occurred to me that I could look to these women's experience and what they accomplished and went through and experienced in their World War II, which they actually lived through, and the contributions and the things that they saw as their patriotic duty, and everything that they did during that time to persevere and to overcome a really difficult time. And that was when I just sort of started uncovering these little gems and lessons that I had experienced in the interviewing process and meeting these women and researching the history of the league, which it seems like a no-brainer, but that was something I really hadn't been doing. I'd been so focused on preserving their legacy and presenting it in an accessible, fun, and appealing way, and telling these stories that it was at this time that I just actually sort of absorbed my own story in collecting their stories. And so I'm excited to share some of that with you. This is where I started. My creative career was sort of a meandering of many different creative things until I finally just sort of faced my fears and tackled some of the things that I actually really wanted to do. And I never really saw this as a possibility, but combining my love of drawing and cartooning and art and writing and all the things I do, also with my love of baseball. It was not really something that I saw as, I guess, a possibility, but also I just thought of it as maybe something too niche or not really viable for a career. Of course, that's not my entire career, but that's really where this book came from and where a lot of things started. And there was a lot of joy involved in that. But in doing this, which I was privileged enough to do from the press box of several major league ballparks and other things, and pulling a lot of stories from baseball history, which are very compelling in themselves, because baseball in America, as you know, has always, well, it's our national pastime, but it's always just kind of been a larger than life thing. It's almost like folklore, like John Henry and Annie Oakley, and well, there were no Annie Oakley in baseball as far as I knew. So it took really compiling a lot of my own drawings from ballpark and from baseball history. It was just sort of a visual realization that there were no drawings of women, which is aesthetically pretty boring, but also it just was kind of a strange realization. It was very weird, considering that I am a woman, and I was once a girl, and I love baseball, and I am doing all of this and realizing that the only women that I'm drawing are women in the stands, which is great, but it compelled me to want to explore stories of women in baseball and baseball's history. And the first place that I looked was really the first place that I think a lot of people look, which was A League of Their Own, the movie, the 1992 movie. And it was one of my favorites growing up. I don't know how, I mean, if you haven't seen it, my goodness, please see it. But, and it's also the highest grossing baseball movie of all time, which I only just learned a few years ago, which I think says a lot. And I watched it just out of curiosity, but then I wanted to start exploring, the story behind this story. What happened was that really opened up a gigantic rabbit hole of women in baseball. I learned through that really women have existed as long as the sport has, and they've played it for as long as the sport has existed. I really just was not aware of so many of these stories. And if any of these photos look familiar to you and you know the story behind them, then they're really fascinating stories. My favorite being the one in the lower left-hand corner of Jackie Mitchell, right here in Tennessee, where I live, a 17-year-old woman who struck out the two men behind her, who, if you are a fan of baseball, you know that is Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig. But what, it just became so overwhelming. It was like suddenly, where there were no stories, there were countless stories, and I couldn't wait to explore them. But what kept drawing me back to the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League was not just that it was visually more fun. It was an era that I loved to draw from, and the colors and the uniforms and the time and all of that. Really, and also not just because of its placement in history, which is really just an incredibly unlikely time for it to have existed, which is, and it being America's first and so far only professional women's baseball league. But the thing that really grabbed me was the stories. And here's why. The very first story I came across when I was researching the league was that of this woman, Esther Gambardella. And she wasn't, she wasn't a star. She only played, I think, a couple of seasons at the most. Like all of the women who played, she grew up really kind of not filling gender expectations of her time. So she grew up in the 20s and 30s in Chicago, in the Polish neighborhood of Chicago. And she grew up shining shoes of a lot of mobster kingpins, like, Al Capone's guys. She grew up shining their shoes for money. And she would bring the money home, and then she would go play baseball with all the boys in the sandlots in Chicago. And she earned herself the nickname Little Schmatze, which means little rag, because she was so willing to just sort of throw herself around and get injured, no problem. But one of her biggest problems, and one of the things that kept her from really playing, and the reason that her career with the league was cut short, was because she suffered from excessive nosebleeds. And I know that seems really inconsequential, but I grew up getting nosebleeds all the time as a kid. And I also was kind of a tomboy, but I really wasn't able to participate in sports because I would always get these nosebleeds. This is it's such a small thread, but it was one of those things that drew me to the stories of these women and their origin stories, how they grew up in this era and how they didn't quite fit. And they just kept doing this thing they loved, even though it was really not necessarily acceptable. It wasn't expected of them. And, but they just kept doing it because they loved it and they got good at it. And how did they all end up here? Well, just really, really quickly, I'm going to give you just a very brief history of the league, just so you have some context. So most of you will already know that when the United States entered into World War II in 1941, the entire country mobilized. A lot of industrial factories, from auto parts to chewing gum, switched over to war production, and regular citizens were rationing everything from food to fuel, and pretty much every able-bodied man enlisted in the armed forces. And for the first time officially, many women could also serve their country, because men were vacating these workforce spaces, like in factories and office spaces. They were vacating en masse, so women were required to fill in. They very quickly proved that we could do everything that men can do. And it was decided also during this time that because so many people were working in factories and mobilizing for this effort, that recreation and leisure were actually a necessity. Baseball was one of those things. It was, it was a big source of recreation and leisure in the country at the time. And it was decided that it would be necessary to the health and the morale of the country. So it was decided that baseball should continue. It didn't during World War I. It was thought of as just kind of peripheral and unnecessary. World War II was very different. But because there were very few men around at that point to play, women also filled in this position. P.K. Wrigley, the chewing gum magnate, decided to start, actually it started as a softball league, which very quickly evolved into baseball because of the competitiveness and the athleticism of the women. It was decided that if they were playing softball, it would actually end up being pretty boring because they were so good that it was just, they needed something more competitive. So, and I've put here what are the three primary credits to the league's early success. And it was very successful, contrary to what A League of Their Own, the movie kind of portrays, is that it was just kind of a single season during the war, and then as soon as the men came back, it ended. And that actually isn't true. It went on for 12 seasons. And this is what you could really credit to its success, was that the league, the teams were in Midwestern towns where all these factories were, making it really easy for people to go catch a game after they worked all day in the factory, or spend time with their family. They couldn't go far because there were gas rations. So it was right there in their hometown. The second thing was that Western societal standards meant that if these women were going to play and they were going to draw a crowd, they had to be very dainty and feminine looking. They had to almost look like, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Sonja Henning, the figure skater of the era, but that's, these skirts, these uniforms come from, they were inspired by her figure skating uniforms, which or outfits, which is not really conducive to playing baseball, and also field hockey, also not like baseball. But skill was prioritized over femininity or over, looks, I guess you could say. So a lot of people have speculated that they just kind of got these attractive women to play to draw crowds. In fact, it was really kind of the other way around. And actually, a lot of them attended charm school to learn how to be more ladylike, so that they could sort of bring that to the field where they were already playing amazing baseball. So this uniform obviously is very incredibly impractical. And I loved hearing stories from women talking about playing, and they talked about, going to field a ground ball and your skirt flies up in your face. Or the big one being sliding. These women spent entire seasons with giant, what they called strawberries on their thighs. So they would slide it would just be, basically they just had gaping wounds for an entire baseball season. They would slide on one side, and then when they just couldn't stand anymore, they would, patch it up, try to let it heal, slide on the other side for a while. It's just awful. But researching all of these things, this was not, I can read books, you can research the internet, but I really wanted to get to the source. And the other reason why I chose this league and this era was that a lot of these women at the time were still alive, and therefore could be interviewed, and therefore I could get their stories firsthand. I could hear more from Esther Gambardella, who I did get to call. And it was, I felt like I was calling a rock star or something, because this was the first woman whose story I came across. And she told me all about shining these guys' shoes and many other stories. But I was identifying with a lot of these women's stories as they happened 70 years ago. And it was very much stepping outside of my comfort zone. Hunting down elderly women to get information is really it's not something I'm accustomed to. And it's, if you've never done this kind of research, it's intimidating to be interviewing people and to track people down. It's not really my nature to want to pry or hunt people down and get them to talk openly. And I really wanted people to speak openly about this experience, because everything that we had up until then was really just pretty much Penny Marshall's movie, and then a few smaller documentaries and information you can get on the internet. And if any of you have seen the new A League of Their Own series on Amazon, also fictionalized, but definitely a little more open and honest about some of these experiences. And they had to fictionalize it because that is a lot of those experiences are things that the women were still not very comfortable speaking about. So I wanted it to be as open and honest as possible, while also celebrating this legacy. This is one thing they got right in the movie. That's actually real. I love to tell people that this woman got so into her role in A League of Their Own that she slid and got herself a real, actual strawberry. But one of the things that really stuck out to me, the more that I got to talk to these women, I was calling them. I was flying across the country to meet with them in person. I was meeting them in their hometowns. I met one woman, Betsy Jocham, who is now 102. I met her in South Bend, and we went to the South Bend History Museum, and just these incredible experiences. And I really tried to spend as much time with them as possible, just so that they could kind of relax and open up. And one thing that really struck me was this part, that despite the uniforms, despite how they had to wear lipstick on or off the field, they'd be called up to bat, and the chaperone would remind them to put on their lipstick before they hit the field. Otherwise, they would be fined. They were not allowed to wear pants at any point in public. So if they were on the bus all night long, and they were in their pants just to be comfortable to sleep, if they wanted to get off and use the restroom at a gas station or something, they would have to put a skirt on over their pants. All these things that we think of as just sort of this misogynistic imposition, which, obviously it was, and it is. But these women also were experiencing something that women at the time absolutely did not experience. Many of them were leaving home for the very first time, their hometown for the very first time, to hit the road and play. Most of them were leaving home for the very first time, most if not all of them, leaving home for the first time without the presence of family or a husband. And they were with each other, and they're having this shared experience as a group of women, traveling around, making more money than their own fathers did. They were paid like professional athletes. This was such an incredibly unique experience, and the camaraderie and the empowerment of having this many women together, having this experience at one of the most unlikely times in history, just grew increasingly fascinating to me. And I figured there had to be more to it. There had to be a ripple effect. And one of the questions that we ask so often now about when we're talking about women in baseball is, when will women join the major leagues? When will women be in Major League Baseball? And that was always the question I wanted to ask. When will we see a woman playing on the Pittsburgh Pirates, when we see a woman playing on the San Francisco Giants, which is my home team. And I realized through these women that was actually the wrong question. Not the wrong question, but not the most important question. This experience and seeing their shared experience is what made me realize that this is actually the most empowering scenario for women that they could be experiencing, was being able to play with one another. And I learned not just through their stories about playing with one another, but I also learned through stories like the two that I'm about to share with you. This is Jean Fout. Jean Fout is one of my absolute heroes. She was also just one of the most incredible women I ever had the pleasure of meeting. Sadly, Jean Fout just passed away last month, and at the ripe age of 97, I believe she was 97. Jean Fout is incredible as a baseball player, among other things, but because this is about her experience in baseball, we'll focus on that. Her lifetime earned run average, if you're familiar with baseball, earned run average is basically an average of the runs that you give up as a pitcher. Her numbers were incredible. She threw 4 no-hitters, meaning she gave up no hits in 4 different games. 2 of those were perfect games. Now, she is the only professional baseball player, man or woman, to have ever pitched more than 1 perfect game. And I've put a definition of the perfect game at the bottom there so you can find out what that is. These accomplishments are astounding, of course, and she was like player of the year over and over. There were celebrations. There was Jean Fout night. There was, all kinds of things to celebrate her. She was on the All-Star team several years in a row. But what's particularly impressive to me is that Jean really missed out on the experience of camaraderie and the shared experience of playing with these women. And that is because her second season playing, she showed up to spring training, and her coach was the man that's seated right behind her in that photo on your right. That is her husband. He was a minor league prospect that never made it to the big leagues. And she showed up to spring training and he was her coach. She had no idea this was happening. He gave no indication, and he had signed the contract to be the coach 6 months before that. So for 6 months, he never mentioned to her that he would be her coach. He showed up. It turns out he was a pretty good coach, but he was not a well-loved coach. He was kind of a jerk, actually, as some of the women recall, to put it not so mildly. And there are definitely some harsher stories about him, but he was not a very well-loved coach. And this really drove a wedge between Jean and her teammates. They figured that she was being favored. She was put in rotation all the time. She played infield and pitched. And really, it was because she was just so damn good. But because they were on the road together, it really isolated Jean from her teammates, or she was isolated from her teammates. And when she was asked about this, I asked her, I said, how were you able to just keep getting better and better and better despite all of this, despite all these hardships? Like, for example, going to the championship, and her husband, the coach, gets in an argument with a teammate, basically tells her to leave. She storms off, and several players leave in solidarity, and they are left completely shorthanded. They are left with barely enough players to hit the field, and they miraculously won that championship. But and she just said, you just focus, everything else falls away. You just can't pay attention to those things. She completely excelled and persevered in the game, but the situation with her husband and his jealousy of her success got to be so overwhelming that she quit at the peak of her career. She basically decided not to return. They did later get a divorce, but his overwhelming jealousy at her success is essentially, forced her to end her own career. She was able to later connect with her teammates, several years later when they started having reunions, and she was very much loved by other women in the league, other veterans of the league, and they all had a very special relationship. But at the time, I just can't imagine anything more lonely than being so alone on your team and still managing to persevere until, however, you learn about Toni Stone. This is another example of being without that. And I would say that, when we talk about what about a woman in the major leagues, this is actually it. This is it. The Negro Leagues were born out of segregation in baseball, and they were essentially the major leagues of Black baseball. There are players that are just like absolutely larger than life with records that probably supersede a lot of legends in Major League Baseball, but because of their record keeping and bias in journalism and all of that, and institutional racism in the reporting and, their ability to play at certain times in certain places with certain limitations and equipment and all of that, we'll never actually know specifically. But Toni Stone wanted to play baseball her entire life. That's all she ever wanted. Her love for the game was so overwhelming, it disappointed everyone around her, disappointed her parents. They wanted her to do anything else. Speaking of figure skating, her mother signed her up for figure skating and said, you're going to do something a little more, if you're going to do something athletic, it's going to be more feminine. She basically swept like every state championship and was like, okay, I'm done. I did it. I did so well at figure skating. Can I play baseball now? And there was no viable option for her to play. There was a team that played locally, a young boys team, all white boys. And she would hang around that field and pester the coach all day long. And he would send her away. He wanted nothing to do with her. Finally, she got through to him, and he actually took him under her wing, gave her her first pair of cleats, her first gloves. He was a known higher up in the local Ku Klux Klan at the time in Minnesota. And we don't know if she knew that at the time or not, but she was so blinded by her love of baseball. She moved to San Francisco to be near her sister, got herself a job and a place to live within 24 hours, and shortly thereafter got herself a place on the local American Legion team. Then she earned herself a spot on the San Francisco Seals, which is a very short-lived West Coast Negro Leagues expansion, which then earned her a spot on the Indianapolis Clowns, which is one of the teams in the Negro Leagues. And she was the first woman really to play professional baseball with men. And it didn't come easy. As she said, nothing comes easy. She fought her way there. And then when she finally made it, the experiences she had to sleep in brothels because she couldn't sleep where her teammates slept. Sometimes she had to just sleep on the bus. There was no place for her to change her clothes. There was no locker room for her, so she would have to change her clothes on the bus. She wouldn't be able to shower after a game. And this is on top of the way that several of her teammates treated her, the way that fans treated her, the way the entire Negro Leagues, the management, everyone. She was completely underpaid. She was underappreciated. She played her ass off. She really just kind of had an unrequited love affair with baseball her entire life. And that example of being the only, Toni Stone was really just the only everywhere she went. And for as difficult as it is for women in general in any space to try to be the first and the only, Justine Siegel is the first woman to coach in a major league team. And she runs an organization now called Baseball for All. And I interviewed her for the afterword of my book. And she said, being the first of anything is overwhelming, in that, it's a privilege, but sometimes it's so overwhelming you don't want to get out of bed in the morning. But you have to, because there are girls behind you and there are women behind you. But that is, this in any space, being the first, being the only, it's so challenging for women in general. But being a woman of color, or add to being a woman anything else, being a woman of color, being a queer woman, being being a transgender woman, any other, I guess what we call for having being neurodivergent would be a comorbidity. This is the experience that these women miss out on and persevere through. This is Malika Underwood. She plays for Team USA. I won't dive into her story of how she got there, but if you ever have the opportunity, or if you happen to read the afterword in my book, you can find out how she got there. It's really, again, very, very interesting and compelling. But she says, it is no secret if you ask any girl or woman who has had to prove themselves above and beyond in order to get to the same place as a boy or a man on the baseball field, it can be frustrating. You feel this additional pressure to be perfect in a game that's not perfect. Playing with that constraint is really freeing. The struggle doesn't feel so lonely. And, there are a lot of spaces that, outside of baseball that, that this exists, but baseball is one of those places where there are no really viable pathways for women. If you're a little girl who wants to play baseball for a living, figure out your way there. So Malika is playing baseball for Team USA some 70 years after the women of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. And not a whole lot has changed, but I started asking myself, after interviewing Malika and women like Isla Borders and Justine Siegel, who I just told you about, who are all contemporary women in baseball, and then interviewing all these women who played during World War II and in the early 1950s, I started to ask myself what they have in common. What do these women have in common that allowed them to persevere in the most unlikely of circumstances? And in sifting through all my interviews and just sort of exploring my own experiences with these women, it really came down to two components. And that seems very distilled and maybe oversimplified, but it really genuinely has come down to two things in my firm belief. And the first of those things is grit. I love to implore people to kind of take a moment to ask themselves what you think of as grit, or what is your definition of grit. There is one part that, one part of grit is the part where you're pushing through critics and naysayers, and you're pushing through a lot of pain and heartache, like Jean Fout, who said you just turn everything off and you just focus, or you channel it all into your dream. Isla Borders, who I interviewed, you can read up on who she is or Google who she is. If I had more time, I would tell you about all of them. But Isla Borders said she, in her quest to play baseball, she only focused on the yeses. For every 10 no's, there was one yes. And if she allowed herself to focus on the no, she would never get there. So she only focused on the yes. Pardon me. I'm going to play this audio clip for you while I call.
So when anybody asks me afterward, what are you going to do when you grow up? And I said, I'm going to play professional baseball. Not knowing there was such a thing anywhere in the country, and my classmates at high school, when I was a senior, kept saying, Salty, now what are you going to do when you graduate? I said, I'm going to play professional baseball. And I'm sure some of them laughed in my face. Some of them maybe behind my back. They probably thought I'd lost it. Because, as they say, nobody around here knew that such a thing existed anywhere.
That's Sarah Jane Sands. She goes by the nickname Salty, which I love, and it's well earned, apparently, according to local townspeople. That was my interview with her. And to me, that's the other component of the first component of grit, is that every single one of these women found a way to continue doing the thing that they loved, the thing they were passionate about, the thing that drove them, the thing that kept them up at night, the thing that kept them moving forward, when there was no viable path in existence, when everybody said you can't. I know that sounds cliche, it sounds like something out of a movie, but we have so many more opportunities now, many of them thanks to these women, but there are still a lot of things, and baseball is one of them. Professional baseball is still one of them. This many years later, I'm playing you this audio clip from a woman who played 65 years ago, and still there is no way for a woman who wants to play professional baseball to actually get there. There is a way, but it's a completely made up path. You have to navigate your own way. There's no step 1, 2, 3, and then you're there. And then once you're there, where are you actually? There is no place to play professional baseball in America for women. So, and there are several spaces where that's still kind of a thing. And so the thing that's really so interesting to me is that these women in the 1940s, people, as Salty said, there was no such thing. Nobody ever knew there was such a thing, but she just kept saying it and she just kept believing it and she actually kept doing it. And then when the opportunity finally came, she was good enough to live out her dream. And that is the second component of the thing that these women all have in common, spanning through time, that I kind of arrived at. And also that I think is just an absolute necessity and key ingredient to these women actually living out this dream and having this experience, and I guess you could say success. This is another of my very favorite quotes from one of the players. She was a catcher. But you'll notice in the last line, the key word there is opportunity. And that is the second component. So grit, these women just exemplifying grit in every way, shape, and form. But then there's opportunity. So I guess my take on opportunity that I think is so interesting is that, you can, success, they say the definition of success is when preparedness meets opportunity, but I would go farther than that. I think preparedness is just kind of a byproduct of grit. And some people inherently have grit. Some people are born with opportunity, but it's kind of rare that both of those things are inherently in someone or in their upbringing at the same time. Some people have a lifetime of opportunity after opportunity. They have failure after failure, but each failure is just followed by another opportunity, and they never really have to develop grit. On the other hand, there are people who are born with or develop grit, and really those people, all you ever need is one good opportunity. Grit will open doors and find more opportunity. Grit doesn't stop with failure. It feeds off of failure. And grit really allows for the creation of more opportunity. If you can just get the one opportunity, or a series of small opportunities, if ever there's an opportunity, then you get yourself wedged into that door that allows you to start creating opportunity, more opportunity for yourself and for the people behind you, when you have developed a certain amount of grit. And this, I can't put it any better than Dolly Brumfeld here.
I think World War II was the really big one for my generation. The times changed. Women had to leave the home and the kitchen. And the statement in the movie that stands out, and now that the men are coming back, you women get back in the kitchen. I'm sorry, you've opened the door of opportunity and we're not in the kitchen. We're out in the world being productive and doing other things and having other opportunities. Opportunity is the key word. You have to have an opportunity. What would my life have been without that opportunity, that someone saw something in me that they thought would do something in baseball, and I got the opportunity to do that? Do I have any other skills that would have gotten me the door that opened for me to have an education, to travel, to meet all these people, to have friends all over the country, and to travel to Cuba? And these were the things. It's opportunity. I don't care what it is that you do. If you don't have if you have the greatest of skill, but you have no opportunity to use it, it's completely lost. We have to have opportunity to do things. And we're still on the threshold of that in women's baseball, because we're trying to get it into the Olympics now. And I've been trying to support the girls that are trying to play baseball today. And we do have a number of them. Some of them are right here in this program we're doing today. There is a Team USA women's baseball, and I'm very proud of that. And I'm hoping one day that we're going to have the women to play that again.
So sorry, spoiler, there is no women's baseball in the Olympics. And this year there is no men's, or this time around there is no men's either. But every woman I had the pleasure of interviewing had the grit to develop the skill to build a reality that would prepare them for opportunity. And the opportunity that these women had to play professional ball actually afforded them a lot. They were earning, like I said, they earned more money playing baseball than a lot of their own fathers, which gave them access to higher education. The average percentage of women in this league of baseball players who graduated with higher degrees superseded the national average at the time by nearly 60%. They had better jobs. They kept the jobs that a lot of women were actually sort of like forced back out of after the war. It gave them platforms. One woman became the first sportscaster, the first woman sportscaster in Canada. A lot of those women went on to do other firsts. But really, they had platforms and experience and confidence and knowledge to impart possibility to other girls and other women. Over 600 women utilized their professional experience and their salaries to blaze these trails for the generations behind them and send a ripple. And that is without the movie even. The movie League of Their Own in 1992, however fictional and Hollywood and funny and sweet it is actually really what made this league's existence known to the country. And that is because I think a lot of these women maybe didn't understand the importance of what they had done, but because of the stigma, because of that sort of post-war push back into domestic roles, because of all these like negative things associated with it, these women were not believed when they told people that they played professional baseball. Because remember, I told you that these teams were concentrated in these Midwest towns where the factories were. So when those factories went back to their regular production and when the league ceased to exist, beginning in 1954, that was the first season that it stopped, or it stopped in 1954. People went their own ways, they did their own things, and really it only existed in the memory of the people who actually saw it. And when they retell those stories, it's incredible the way that some of these people talk about having seen these women play. But other than that, nobody knew it existed, and these women didn't talk about it. They never talked about their experiences. A lot of them said, I would tell someone I played professional baseball, and they'd say, "Oh, you mean softball?" No, baseball. But you played softball. No, I played baseball. And it would just go back and forth and back and forth. And one woman said, I couldn't carry my scrapbooks around with me everywhere I went, so I just stopped telling people. Other women, they just got so tired of having to explain it or deal with the comments that came back to them that they just stayed silent. And this brings me to the importance of story, that even though Penny Marshall's movie is as wonderful as it is, isn't really like the full, totally honest history. It's a wonderful story, and that story, like the story of Esther Gambardella, who is not the star baseball player by any means, but whose story about getting nosebleeds is what compelled me to want to, it pulled me in, it related, I related to it. How many times have you had the experience where you learned about some incredible woman or a person of color in history who did some incredible thing, and you think to yourself, how did I not know about this? Why weren't we taught this? And what it does is it compels you. I always like to explain it's like a piece of yarn on a sweater, and you pull on it, and pretty soon it starts to unravel, and you unravel you start learning more stories, and your curiosity and you're just compelled to learn more and more and more, and you want to know more stories like this because you figure if there's one, there's got to be more, and there always is. And that power of story and of being able to share your own story, a lot of these women had family who did not know that their own mother, grandmother, aunt, whatever, played professional baseball until they went to see the movie, and they said, I did that. Oh, that was me. I played it, or participated in the production of the movie. Oh, grandma's going to be in a movie. What are you in this movie about? Well, it's based on the experience that I actually lived. And in sharing that story, you know, that ripple effect that I was talking about through their personal experiences was actually able to extend even beyond the girls and women in their sphere. These are some wonderful pictures of some of the former players. Maybelle Blair, you may have seen her in the news recently. She was doing a lot of promo stuff with the new A League of Their Own on Amazon. But in realizing what they had done, in understanding their own sense of importance, when the movie came out and people realized what a big deal this was, these women were starting to find one another again. They had reunions. They started to really reflect on their shared experience and the importance of it, and what that had equipped them with to then carry forward in life, and how that may have positively impacted other girls and women moving forward, without them really even knowing it. Once they realized that, they felt empowered to share their own stories, the real story, the truth beyond A League of Their Own, and interact with more and more women, more and more girls. And it really, you know, understanding the value of their own story is what propelled this forward. And this is kind of the last thing I'll share with you. This is Beth Greenwood. She is actually currently playing NCAA baseball in college, and she's, I believe, the first woman to be on the NCAA men's college baseball team, I believe. But she is playing now, but she was part of Justine Siegel's Baseball for All program, which I told you about, which essentially helps the creation of girls baseball teams. And then they have these tournaments that allow them to come from all over the country and play one another. And at one of these tournaments, Maybelle, who I showed you the picture of, Maybelle, in the upper right corner, you see Maybelle, and that's Shirley Berkovich, who unfortunately we also lost this past year. She's wonderful. Maybelle and Shirley did all kinds of things together to promote girls and women's baseball. And Beth met them at this tournament. Now, Beth is, she's in college now, so you can imagine she's too young to remember the movie A League of Their Own. It kind of blows my mind and makes me feel really old that there are full-fledged adults who are having their own children who were born after A League of Their Own came out and had no idea that that movie existed. That's a strange thing about getting older. But so she didn't know, and she met them, and it absolutely blew her mind. She said, I would always dream that there could be a league, like a women's league. I didn't know that it had already happened. I didn't know that there already had been one. So suddenly the possibility of it existing just, the impossibility dissolved, and the possibility became very real for her. And she realized that this dream that she had could maybe happen. Since it's happened, because it has happened, there's no reason why it couldn't happen again. And so this is the point in sharing all of this, that I love to share with everyone, but particularly in a community with libraries, which, like, God bless libraries and librarians. And I know that of so many groups that are under attack right now, libraries and librarians are so undeserving of this, because this is what you do. You propel and you share story, and you encourage story, you encourage this kind of thing, because it really opens up worlds of possibility for people who carry that forward and carry forward possibility to the people behind them. And it just ripples. And that's all through story and the sharing of story. And I would also say that, I do this also, sharing other stories, which is wonderful, but these women did not realize the importance of what they had done at the time, and now they're empowered to share their own story. So I will just leave you with a little thought to maybe take some time to consider your own story and think about the power that holds, and that maybe possibly there is an unrealized significance to your own story that will pass forward possibilities from people behind you at some point, either soon or in the future. So thank you very much. And I will end my screen sharing and take any questions or anything that anyone has.
Thank you so much, Anika. What a wonderful, wonderful presentation. We don't have anything in the questions or the chat at the moment, but I was just curious, what is your next your next project that you're working on?
Well, I didn't necessarily mean for it to be in the same vein, but I guess because I did this, it naturally attracts these kind of projects. I am currently illustrating. I did not write, but I'm illustrating a book, a children's picture book by Amy G. She was a broadcaster for the San Francisco Giants, and she has kind of a series of books about this little girl named Smarty Marty. And in this book, Marty manages the local Little League team. It's very sweet. I'm also illustrating a book, also not written by myself, a really cool book about Alcatraz. And it's kind of full history prior to it being a prison, and then after. Socks, the Christmas album, will now be a picture book, so I will be illustrating that. I don't know if that's been announced yet, though, so you don't tell anyone.
It's announced now.
Yeah, right. No one tell my editor or my agent, please. And I am also working on a graphic novel. That this is kind of in line with what I was talking about, that I've always been so interested and motivated to share the stories of other women that I never really felt like I had anything interesting to share with anyone of my own. I didn't really ever think there was anything about my story that was worth sharing. And I created a comic for the Washington Post about having ADHD, and the response was well beyond what I expected. And it actually kind of opened up some things to where I'm now really excited to be working on a graphic novel, like a memoir about being a girl and a woman with inattentive ADHD. And it's kind of, I guess, a little more of a hot topic now, but I really think that's a good thing. We need to be talking about things like that more, and neurodivergence more. So very excited about that.
Awesome. David asks, did you interact with Cooperstown Hall of Fame in any way, and do they have a copy of your book?
I did. I actually, well, they were really kind enough to allow me access to a lot of their resources. And there are actually several photos in the back of the book that they granted permission to the publisher to print that belong to their archive. And I did do an event, a virtual event with them, an author series event, I believe like a year and a half ago. And also they have a symposium every year, and I presented with their symposium in 2021, I believe. They've been really great. And the women had a reunion. The All-American Girls Professional Baseball League still has an annual reunion. They didn't during COVID, but the last one they had before COVID was in Syracuse, New York, and we paid a visit to the Hall of Fame. And that was really cool to walk through the exhibit. There is an exhibit there honoring all of them. There's a women in baseball exhibit there now, and it was really cool to walk through that with a lot of the former players.
Adam is asking where were some of the what were some of the skills developed and maintained before the league formed? Was it in some kind of little league or with friends, some of both, or somewhere else?
Oh, before the league formed,
like where were they developing their skills?
Yeah, totally on their own. A lot of them, you know, some of them talk about having older brothers that taught them to play. They really just grew up playing with kids in their neighborhood. Almost all of them grew up playing with boys. They were usually the only girl playing. And then several of them, you know, went from kind of like sandlot in terms of like an organized sense. Several of them practiced with local men's teams. They were allowed to practice or work as like a back girl, or, you know, some sort of peripheral thing that would allow them to be in proximity and gain some knowledge and training. As far as executing that, really nothing. A lot of them did play, well, I wouldn't say a lot of them. I would say, you know, maybe a quarter of them maybe played organized softball, usually for like a local, you know, like your local grocery store would have its own softball team. They really didn't have they didn't have athletics in school. Almost none of them had school athletics. It was all extracurricular. It was like a church softball team or an organized softball team for like a local recreation center, or like I said, like a grocery store or department store. So some of them played that, but like I said, the league started as a softball league with some modifications to the rules. And in a span of, very short span of time, the base path distances widened, the mound to plate distance widened, the ball got smaller, the pitching style went from underhand to sidearm to overhand, like very quickly. It basically became full-fledged baseball very quickly. And what's interesting is that a lot of women really felt more comfortable and played better as soon as that happened, because like I said, only about a quarter of them played softball. And those women, a lot of those women grew up playing baseball, but softball was really like the only option, kind of like it is now. So a lot of the women who, they grew up playing baseball with boys, and then they wanted to keep playing, so they had to play softball, but then they were kind of able to come back to baseball once the league came into existence.
Donald doesn't really have a question. He just sort of making a statement. He says, consider writing about conversations that first basemen have with the runners. A question. In the TV show, they explore sexuality. Did any of these women discuss having to stay in the closet, and if that was a fear they had?
So one thing that I think is really great about the show, even though it's a fictionalized take, is that they explore this and are able to, I guess, because queer women were involved in the creation, sort of place themselves there and imagine, I guess you could say. There's a really great documentary called A Secret Love, and it's about a former player and her partner, her lifelong partner, who sadly they both just passed away in recent years, but they met while one of them was playing baseball in the league, and it's about their entire lifelong relationship and how they kept it a secret until they were in their late 70s, early 80s, and they were actually married right before one of them passed away. It's a really kind of a heart-wrenching story, but they were really the only known players to really come out and live an honest existence, and that was really only a couple of years ago. But a lot of the women wouldn't share it with me. They wouldn't talk about it. They just kind of shooed it away. The women who had families were willing to talk about, having their children and their situation with their husband, but the women who had lived in the closet most likely for most of their lives, even those who were openly gay did not feel comfortable sharing that with me. So unfortunately, that was something I really wanted to include in the book, but it wasn't something that, because I was doing what I was doing, I couldn't really speculate or inject my own thoughts on the matter. So I think that's one thing that the show did very well. Maybelle, who I told you about, who travels around with Shirley, what's really great is because that's being explored in the show, it kind of counter-empowered her and gave her more comfort and license to come out. She came out, she's 98, and she just came out this past year. She told me in private once that she, after a few shots of Fireball, she did declare that she was gay as a goose. But, I don't know if that's really constitutes as publicly coming out. She came out on a stage in front of an audience, and I thought that was really, really cool.
Patty says she loves your illustrations and was wondering, where did you train to be an illustrator?
Well, thank you. I mean, I guess just life. I've drawn for as long as I can remember, and I actually have one of the first drawings I ever did. My mom saved it and gave it to me, and it was of my grandpa, which is very appropriate because my grandfather was my person. He was a columnist in the Bay Area, a daily columnist. He wrote like a humor life. He was a great storyteller, a great story guy, and he started as a cartoonist. So I think a lot of what I got initially came from watching him and drawing with him. As far as formal, I took art classes in high school. I went to college, but I got my degree in graphic design because that was safe. I took one illustration course. It was wonderful. But after that, it's really just been a lot of, I did a lot of work in animation, which really helped. Again, like all of my work has really been kind of like peripheral to illustration, and then it all really sort of aids in illustration. Graphic design is actually a good thing to know if you're doing illustration, and same with animation. So.
Okay, we're running out of time, so I'm going to limit it to 3 more questions. Linda mentioned that she coached and umpired baseball in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Did you interview any contemporary women who coach or umpire Little League baseball today?
Yeah. Well, actually, several of the women who played in the league did end up coaching, and shared a lot of that with me. Coaching girls and boys, baseball and other sports as well. A lot of them are very athletic in multiple sports, but a lot of them mostly baseball. Umpires, I didn't formally interview her for the book, but if anyone feels compelled to look up the name Perry Barber, she is a professional umpire. She's incredible, but she does a lot of youth games and Little League games now, but she also did umpire in some collegiate and adult games. But that is you could do an entire book on just that. It's incredible. The things that they have to deal with. That is, as far as being in a male dominated space, I would say umpiring and managing is far more difficult and intimidating. And I don't know if hostile is the right word, but it's just, I mean, from uniforms to, conversation to, like Tony Stone, not having a place to change your clothes. I mean, it's endless.
During your research and interviews, what was the biggest or one of your biggest oh wow moments that you discovered?
Oh gosh, there were a lot. I would say, well, there are a couple of memorable interviews for different comical reasons, but an oh wow, I interviewing Jean Fout was really incredible, and for 2 reasons, or maybe 3 actually. Well, one is that she was almost entirely deaf, so the interview had to be done very close, face to face, so she could read my lips, and in a very quiet space. But because she was kind of reticent to speak about some things, about the discomfort of her, kind of the pain of her experience of having to cut her career short and her whole jealous husband thing, there was also like a bit of a trust barrier. And we had spoken a little bit before, and it was just kind of like, I guess, I don't want to say canned answers, but the answers that you would sort of expect and the answers that she's kind of given to other people who'd interviewed her. In between that, we were at the reunion, and in between that, they have every year a lip sync contest, and I had been nominated to participate in this thing, which is like extra outside of my comfort zone. And I did, of course, true to my nature, I made it about as complicated as possible. I did a lip sync to Debbie Boone's "You Light Up My Life," and I had all these visual aids. So like when it was like, "You Give Me Hope," I would hold up like a picture of Bob Hope. And to "Carry On," I had a picture of Cary Grant. These are all like very era-specific celebrities that I knew these women would appreciate. And it was just like a total chaotic mess, but I poured my heart into it after 1 glass of wine that gave me enough liquid courage to make it through. And I had like a total out-of-body experience. Don't remember anything, but I got a standing ovation after. The room like erupted. I won the contest. People were coming up to me all night after, like, these 85-year-old women were buying me shots of Crown Royal, which was very bad news. But after that, Jean's son came up to me and said, "My mom wants to talk to you again, and would you come to her room tomorrow?" And so I came to her room, and it was like something about my making a total ass out of myself made her want to talk to me. And so we were very close, and she shared so much more with me, and her memories were it's just like so heartbreaking and maddening, but inspiring. And it was a little bit of a serious interview, and then at the very end she remembered this story that's in the book. I turned into like almost like a comic book panel, but the way she told it, she hoisted herself up out of the chair and like yelled the last part, and got really into it herself, and kind of made a little bit of an ass out of herself also. But I guess she felt like she could do that, and it was hysterical. And the warmth of that moment was something that really really stuck with me. And I would say that was definitely an oh wow moment.
All right, we're going to end with this final question. As a woman, did you experience similar resistance when starting your career as an illustrator author?
No resistance as an illustrator author. In fact, I feel like I kind of had a Forrest Gump thing where I just like stumbled into it all being very easy in that respect. It wasn't easy. The creation of it wasn't easy, but finding the publisher and actually doing it, that part, no resistance. And I was very, very lucky that at Chronicle Books, the entire team that I worked with were all women, from the editor to the art director to the designer to the person who helped me design the cover. So that was really, really cool. And I kind of got my own sort of teamwork empowerment experience. However, working in baseball, I will say there may not have been resistance, but I have experienced plenty of patronizing, and I've had several things explained to me that I've actually known my whole life. In the arena of baseball, and then coming out with this book and having several interviews, mostly conducted by men on like sports talk radio and things like that. There were some very interesting experiences. One was two radio hosts before I came on. It was my birthday that day in April. They had me on their show, and before I was on, you're kind of in this like virtual waiting room where I can hear the radio show, but they can't hear me. And they were talking about it being my birthday, and then they started wondering what my age was, and then they started wondering how much I weighed, and we're kind of joking about all these things. And then as soon as I entered the show, I just flat out said, it's my 40th birthday and I weigh 132 pounds. And just to kind of, because I don't think they knew that I could hear them, but they talked about more than that. It was actually very, I almost hung up before I ever got on. But yeah, several interesting experiences like that in baseball for sure.
Well, Anika, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation and presentation. Thank you to everybody that came and participated. Anika's book is at the Adams County Library System. Please check it out and take a look at it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun.